Welcome. My name is Zoe Stedman-Milne, and I'm the creative content producer for Bristol Ideas. We've partnered with BBC New Generation Thinkers on a new series of conversations where we delve into the ideas of the current cohort to explore a wide range of topics. It's an opportunity to examine a subject through a slightly different lens. And today we start with the question, is it better to be an optimist or a pessimist? I'm joined by Oskar Jenson, novelist, historian, and a Newcastle University academic track fellow in arts and humanities, and a BBC New Generation thinker. His most recent book, Vagabonds, Life on the Streets of 19th Century London, was published in 2022, and we'll pop some links for that below. He's currently working on a detective novel, Hell and Death, which will be out early 2024. Welcome, Oskar.
Thank you, Zoe. Hello, it's great to be here.
Your area of research covers two main strands, the history of song and of street culture, and you're part of a 2-year research project funded by the UK's Arts and Humanities Research Council called Our Subversive Voice, which examines the history and politics of the English protest song. And we'll add a link to the website as it's packed full of content that we'll only be able to touch upon in this conversation today. And I highly recommend you go and browse around and discover all the delights that are there. Can you give us a brief overview of the project, what its objectives are and your part in it, and maybe then also turn to the question of optimism versus pessimism and how we can apply that to protest song and the tradition of communicating political messages in song?
I can, Zoe, and that's really good to hear. Thank you. I'm glad you've enjoyed it. People watching, please do check out oursubversivevoice.com. It's been a labour of love, and the editor, Matt Martin, just fantastic web designer. I think it's a really beautiful output, which I would say, having been part of it. And it's interesting saying I'm on it because technically those 2 years have ended, but like many funded projects, the really interesting stuff happens afterwards. So we're now writing the book of this. So optimism versus pessimism. I'm hopefully in an optimistic mode where I'm thinking all these things can be done and shall be done, and they will be joy to the world. So Our Subversive Voice, based at University of East Anglia, the collaboration between politics people, rhetoric people, historians, musicologists. I was trying to be all of those things, I suppose, led by John Street, who's worked a lot on media, celebrity culture, and Rebel Rock was his big book in the 80s, which he doesn't like me to remind him came out in the year I was born. But the point of this was to say, protest song, is it just some person with an acoustic guitar in the 60s? Is it a punk with an interesting haircut? Or is there something more to this, and does it have relevance today? I think the origins of the project came in being very wound up by a series of articles in places like The Guardian saying, where have all the protest songs gone? Why do we not have them anymore? And these people, you're not listening and not listening in the right places. But there was a twofold sort of really cross energy to say, yes, there are protest songs and they're everywhere. They're just not a genre of music. Protest songs, wherever you want to look, often they're in urban contemporary music genres. You get an awful lot of young people in their bedrooms producing really eloquent, beautiful things. But whether it's in things like folk and punk or reggae or dub or classical music, even just any way you look, you will find these songs of protest if you really want to listen. And the other thing was, it's English, which I had some interesting queries about coming to the project. What on earth do we mean when we say English? But the point here was this is about a long history for the protest song not being a product of the 1950s and 60s, which is when you first hear the word, except once in 1848, where there is a protest lied for Schleswig-Holstein, a Danish protest song that calls itself such. But there's only one, and then there's nothing for a century. So do we tag this to the word, or do we think about songs that have been protesting? And if so, they go back forever. So this project starts with the birth of print, really, in the 16th century, and then we took as our real beginning point the turn from the Tudor to the Jacobean period, because you've got some fantastic protest songs being very cross at James I, and slightly problematically, all these Scots coming down to England and taking all the jobs. There's a strong tradition of that kind of thing in English protest songs that you can't ignore and can't whitewash. But we wanted to think about what does it mean if we look at these things across this time period, if we hear them. Are there interesting things to say about English political history, about how one considers protest songs, about how all of that joins up? So on the website, we have a selection of these 250 songs where we poured a lot of energy into them, and another 500 sort of as little amuse-bouches that you can delve further into. We'd be interviewing people, some academics, a lot of songwriters, Billy Bragg, Peggy Seeger were a couple of our first big bags. I did a great interview with Sam Lee the other month. and asking other people to give opinions. There's a lot to spark there. And we've worked with groups today, the Common Lot, a Norwich community theatre troupe, amazing people, about 50 of them. We did a wonderful series of theatrical song projects last summer in Norwich that we took to the Latitude Festival then. Got thousands of people all joining in songs, some fantastic songs like God Save Great Thomas Paine, which is a 1790s rewriting of God Save the King. It's nice to be able to call it God Save the King again. That's what I mostly know it as a historian. Yeah, like down with aristocracy, set up democracy, and a lot about, a nice anti-tyrannical song. And a number of them from centuries ago that have real relevance and pertinence today. The problem with something like taking 420 years of English protest songs is it might lead you into a very pessimistic perspective, because the more you say, yes, that really speaks to today. This song about the cost of living from the 1610s, this song about rights for women from 1910 or from 1800, this song about structural racism from the 1790s, these things all speak to us today. And anti-war songs, songs about police violence, inequality of various kinds. The Pout Complaint from 1619, which is about the draining of the fens in East Anglia, and is a sort of, we want to call it an environmentalist protest song, because it's arguing about redistribution of wealth and land ownership and things that are being done agriculturally, but it really roots it in a sense of place and the environment and the damage that will be done to the landscape and to the sea creatures and that kind of thing. And that really resonates to me with something like 4 Degrees by Anohni from 2016, or there's a great rewrite of A Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square that XR experimented with a couple of years ago, where suddenly in Berkeley Square there was a sort of mass event, thousands of people playing the sound of a nightingale and singing this new version of the song. But the tragic irony is that the song will not be heard very often in England's woods much longer. So dwelling on all of that does make one perhaps slightly pessimistic. But the fact that you hear these songs and those voices endure and they're always being raised and will always continue is for me a great source of optimism looking forward. There's never been a point at which people haven't, however downcast or cowed or however much the odds have been stacked against them, haven't organized. The 19th century in particular is a great shining example of the power of people to organize, even when the laws, the 6 acts of Pitt the Younger, and then the Stamp Act in particular, rights against association, freedom of assembly, when these things were leveled against them, we had things like Peterloo and many other brutal repressions of protests. And yet you fight through it and you end up with universal suffrage. And for some reason, that idea of the right to protest being clamped down upon strikes me as relevant in 2023. Might be a certain bill going through at the moment. But I also wanted to think about optimism and pessimism as a really interesting way to think through how protest songs work. Because we've done a lot with members of the public, and the question we often get asked is, but do they work? These songs, they don't work today. They don't change anything. And to which one answer we've heard from a lot of songwriters and we've thought about is, but imagine if those songs weren't there, which speaks to my previous point, I suppose. How different would that picture be? What an emptying out of that sort of sonic, mental, emotional space of politics it would be without the songs. It would be horrific. But also, how do you possibly measure whether these songs work and succeed? And what are they trying to do in the first place? And this struck me as an interesting way of looking at specific songs. So if you have a political song, you can aim for something rhetorically optimistic or something pessimistic. You can do this with recourse to the music, to the tune. Are you going for a sort of stirring, upbeat anthem? Also very much in the lyrics, you can do something interesting about the interplay between those two things. You could have extreme examples on either side. One I've mentioned already, 4 Degrees from 2016 by Anohni. Do check this out if you haven't heard it. It is a pulsing disco banger. Anohni used to be Anthony the Johnsons, and his sort of great piano-based torch songs, and then she turned more latterly to these really intense electro sort of New York sounds. But it takes on the voice of someone who wants to see the world burn. And if there's only this rise, then just imagining watching all of the animals burning and the forests and trees. And it's this apocalyptic vision that, as it goes on, you associate perhaps with the underlying voice of the corporate interests that are still lobbying for gas extraction. And you think, who could possibly inhabit this perspective of wanting these things? And there's a turn there. Yes, that's really what you're asking, you're wanting to see if you pursue these policies. The deep inhumanity of that really comes across through this perspective that is immensely pessimistic, that offers no hope, and that takes a sheer delight in destruction. As a listener, it forces you to do that work. And that work is being encouraged by the bass thrumming through your body and doing that kind of thing. It takes you to a really interesting place. But I think with an optimistic song, it's a lot easier to reinforce the status quo. Imagine you have a whole group of people together singing something very upbeat, makes them feel good together. That can go in very different directions. And if you want to protest, that might be a precondition for going on a march, going on a demonstration. You're all organized, you're going together, you want to be there, you've got to be enduring the rain for 4 hours, you've got to be putting up with the police. That song can do a lot to keep you there. But in terms of your political argument, you've got to go a step further to the thing you want to see changed. But if you just stay at that point of, yes, we are all here, yes, this is all excellent, that's a strong argument for things being all right as they are. And that's where things like national anthems come from, that this view of any number of songs that are making people, patriotic songs that make people happy with the world they're in at the moment, which is perhaps the sort of really strong underlying and unrecognized force for not changing things in a way.
Well, because one of the things
I should probably let you come in at this point.
Well, as you were speaking, I was thinking that it's quite interesting that in a way what a protest song is trying to do is sort of rile people up to protest. So by the very nature of it, you have to think about what is going to rile people up. But at the same time, I suppose my question would be, is holding something hopeful up as much as an incentive as holding up something negative? So do you think a song that promises a better future is better, so this is what we're striving for, as opposed to we're all going down in flames, join me?
Exactly. You have to have something to fight for. You have to have something to hold out. And that would very much be the perspective of a lot of the socialist songwriters of the late 19th century. If you think about those very well-intentioned, often very well-off, slightly misguided people, you might think of William Morris in the first instance. Looking at the beautiful decorations behind you, I can see William Morris might be someone who comes to mind. But he was very invested in writing socialist protest songs, and he was one of a number of people who had these songs about, what oh my lads, let's all get together, we're fighting for a better future. And to our ear today, they might come across as remarkably patrician and almost condescending, and a bit empty, because that rhetoric is all being put into that moral exhortation that there's a brighter tomorrow. If you go to the ultimate example there, you think of the film Cabaret and that chilling boy singing the song that sounds, it's all beautiful and turns out to be this great Nazi anthem. So there's something there of almost a sort of emptiness of rhetoric. But was that the case then? It's very hard to get across that. Edith Nesbit, the writer of children's stories, very famous for that. She was a great socialist protest songwriter.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, that's kind of not really known about her at all, is it?
She's wonderful. She's got a remarkable life. Her song, Come Gather, O People, which she set to the 18th century theatre tune, Hearts of Oak. A very sort of jolly patriotic anthem. She made this a socialist and Republican song for dismantling the Houses of Parliament as they were constituted, but with a lot of stress on how the pen, not the sword, is our weapon, and being very clear that this is not about armed protest, but it was very much about come and gather people. Now is the hour. Now is the time. Making clear the good things to come, and I can see how that really works in marshalling support.
I was just going to pick up on the tune aspect of it. So the idea that maybe a tune could be positive or a negative, and I suppose when you're thinking about more military march type of music, that could be considered more pessimistic as opposed to something more sort of lighter and uplifting. So yeah, does that play a role in the song as well?
Now, speaking as a musicologist, I have to say, how do we say that a tune is negative or positive? And I trained as a historian, and my first time in a music department encountered a lot of people getting very cross at the idea that musical notes, which are abstract, non-semantic things, they have no meaning in themselves, can be objectively happy or sad or anything. People are getting very furious with it. And actually, a great Victorian thinker about this, the Reverend, I never know how to pronounce his name, Haweis, Haweis. Someone told me once how to say it. I'm not sure I believe them. Maybe just Hawes. Anyway, he had a lovely thought experiment of taking a lot of blackface minstrel songs at the time, which were musically, they were often in 2/4, they were very short, they were very upbeat, big choruses, very catchy, massively informs what we know as pop song today, and was sort of the epitome to the Victorians of good fun, dancing, underpinned by some very racist assumptions, but they had that view of being super positive. Because if you slow them down to far fewer beats per minute, they essentially sound like psalms. This idea of the delivery of things in so many ways. Scots Were Hey, great Rabbie Burns song. Scots Were Hey, da-dum-ba-dum, bum-ba-dum-ba-dum-ba-dum. That one. If you go on YouTube, recordings of that, but take it down to a sort of lilting lullaby, and ones where it really is this furious march. So there's a lot you can do with the music in that sense. But I want to give an interesting example, which is from about 1788 to the early 1800s. The abolitionist movement against slave trade in the first instance, and after that against slavery in Britain, produced a lot of songs that I'm going to call protest songs. But they're not forceful, they're not strident, they're not angry, and they're not telling anyone to do anything. They are sentimental pleasure garden ballads, and they sound very pretty. And you would have them performed at Vauxhall Gardens or in the theatres with a sort of very small orchestra, some nice strings, a bit of woodwind in there, and a famous singer of the day singing in very elegant tones. And they would be a narrative ballad. They would invoice the perspective, normally in standard RP English, not in that kind of awful pidgin English that people use for blackface minstrel songs. The perspective of a slave being transported across the Atlantic. And this would normally end in his suicide, his suffering, his throwing himself overboard, being weighed down by chains. This has unfortunate consequences. It led to a lot of ideas about victimhood and the passivity of enslaved peoples. But it was actually in tune with a lot of thinking at the time coming from people like Goethe and his Sorrows of Young Werther, where your absolute hero was a sort of suffering, tragic young man who might be driven to suicide by the strength of his passion. So in that way, not racially based. But the whole point of their argument was to have these songs not to advance an argument and to make people feel cross, but so that people would enjoy these songs, so that women would buy them, would play them, elite women would play them in their drawing rooms, and would enter into sympathy with these characters they were giving voice to. And that could lead to very direct change in the first instance by those women who ran their households boycotting sugar, for example, or doing economic things to do with the slave trade, and also then petitioning their husbands or brothers or people who maybe had a voice in parliament to join the cause as well. And that kind of through the backdoor use of tunes that are very sentimental and could either feel very pleasant or that sort of pleasant tragedy, actually having quite a cunning effect.
And it's an interesting sort of example of sort of beginnings of sort of music marketing, I suppose, in a way. That idea that sort of get it into in the hands of the right people, and there's sort of the soft power of music almost.
Very much so. Soft power is exactly what they're doing.
One of the things you also talk very interestingly about when you talk about reducing down the masses of songs to the ones that you focus on the website is the idea that some of these songs are only available because individuals maybe were preserving and collecting them quite specifically. And actually that's a lot of protest songs that have probably fallen by the wayside and disappeared. And I wondered, again, thinking about whether there's what kind of people have gone and collected them, and whether they would have imposed their own ideas of optimism and pessimism onto their own collections. I don't know whether that's something you've thought about, whether it's something you think is just down to personal taste, where people are sort of like, no, I just like that song, therefore I'm going to sort of squirrel it away somewhere for the future.
That's a beautiful collection. And obviously the answer is it varies enormously depending on the person. And the great takeaway is we are so subject to the whims and personalities of individual collectors over the centuries. Samuel Pepys is probably the most famous standout name you could think of here, who was a voracious collector of ballads. Very often people would be collecting songs, printed songs, so ballads just with the words, sometimes with a tune indication, of all kinds in their period, whether that's the mid-17th, mid-18th, mid-19th century. And some among those we would deem political and protest songs because they're not a specialist kind of writing. Street songs, songs of the people, cover all topics, and some of them will be protest in the same way that in the pop music industry of the last 50 or so years, many of the people who've written the most powerful protest songs are not political activists, but simply pop stars, musicians who have felt moved to write a particular kind of thing. So a lot of those then might be almost unintentional or non-specific. You do get political collections, and as time goes on, people are doing this intentionally, and movements are collecting songs with those aims. In terms of the optimism, pessimism, one of the strongest examples would be not in England but in Ireland, where songs collected by Dublin Castle, by the authorities. So the British authorities there had a much closer control over what was being sung and printed on the streets of Dublin than people did in England, for various reasons, but most obviously because the political situation was that much more intense and volatile. And so you get an awful lot of songs that are collected, i.e. taken as evidence to be used in trials. So there's a very negative intention to that kind of collection of song, and the pessimistic ideal of stamping them out. One of the most interesting songs on our list that we haven't been able to focus on comes from 1594. It's by Thomas Deloney, a really well-known playwright. This is back in London. And we don't have the song because the London authorities were so successful in stamping out, I think it's called A Complaint of the Great Wanton Scarcity of Corn in the Realm, that no copy survives. We just have very agitated letters from the Mayor of London to Lord Burleigh about this terrible song and how they managed to control it. But that song actually achieved its aim because it was asking for the authorities to abide by their own rules on the release of grain, and they actually did so in the end. They were so scared. But some of these songs that they're to paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld, there are songs that don't exist that we know don't exist. There are songs that don't exist that we don't know don't exist, and so on.
Well, that's just brilliant, though, because then that kind of actually gives them almost more power, and the fact that they, despite the fact that they were eradicated, as it were, that there's a sort of a trace, a little sort of a ghost of them still exists somewhere.
It's beautiful, yeah, and it is the great sort of unknown that gets to you. It's when you have an individual singer on the street, like one of my favorite figures I've ever worked on is Joseph Johnson, who's a black ex-sailor working on the streets of London in the 1810s, and he's not associated with writing any songs. He sings other people's songs, and he sings them as part of his mission to prove his place of belonging in London and for people to give him money as a sailor. So he sings patriotic British sea songs. He does so whilst wearing a model of a brig, a two-masted sailing vessel on his head. That people say, "Oh, this is novelty. This is great. This is very amusing." And isn't he resourceful, one of these sailors, to make a model of his vessel? But it's actually a callback to John Canoe, this Afro-Caribbean festival tradition, which is carried out at the time on slave plantations as a sort of festival of subversion and revolt. And very often you have the figure of John Canoe there wearing a houseboat or boat on their head. And so he's perpetuating this sort of slave tradition as a free, patriotic British sailor on the London street. There's a great doubling there. And we know one of the songs that he sang was actually a protest song, nothing to do with race, but about British seamen. I sing the British seamen's praise, the point of which is protect the hardy tar, because they won the wars for you and now they're impoverished and they're in distress. You better look after them, which is very instrumental if you yourself are begging on the streets in the position of a sailor, but also reinforces his position. But my point was that what other songs is he singing? What other songs are people like him singing that are not picked up? And he, of course, is an incredibly visible example that people write about. But the number of people on the street who are simply left unrecorded, this is endlessly tantalizing. I just always want more things in people's own voices, I suppose.
Well, yes, and I can imagine it must be the most frustrating part about being you, I suppose, is thinking about all the things that you can't get your hands on. This is probably a very simplistic question, but I wondered if you came across any patterns in terms of regionality, and whether can you say with any certainty whether there's sort of more positivity or negativity, I suppose, from certain areas of England, sort of saying England in this case. I'd be quite interested. Are there any patterns, or is it more likely just to do with the time that the song was written, the politics of the time, or is there some sort of regionality to it all?
Yeah, all the songs from Yorkshire are really depressing. Actually, there are patterns that we trace, but it's, again, I don't want to insist on them because we're not scientists. And working with these songs, we've chosen them. They're not representative of everything that existed, because as we said, so many songs are lost. We can say these patterns are indicative of the songs we've looked at. We can't say they tell the true story of history. With that proviso, yes, there are very clear patterns and they're interesting, but also they're often what you would imagine. So you don't get many songs from the Southwest and the East in rural, unindustrialized areas, partly because of population density, partly because of lack of access to printing and therefore survival. But mostly there's a clear narrative of the Industrial Revolution. So most songs come from London up until a certain point where you start seeing them in a lot of other cities and towns, and those tend to be towns and cities from the Midlands and the North and so on, where suddenly you get explosions in urban population, in mechanization, in that sort of thing. And that goes along with the birth of the working class from the late 18th into the early 20th century as a thing very clearly. So Newcastle, where I am at the moment, has a great record in protest song, very subversive, and you can analyze that quite a clear level, and I think would be distinguished for the caustic humor and wit of its songs, but I probably would say that up here. Again, Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, you get very strong things from these places. And London maintains its place throughout, and probably in recent decades has become more central again as the music industry has once again returned to be largely centered upon the capital. There are other patterns and trends as well, though, in terms of what people are singing about. There are some sort of ever present throughout these centuries. People are always cross about war and the impact of economic and social change. Some things become more and less prevalent. The big shift, the big swing from, say, the 17th century to the present day is from a focus on sort of what you might think of as the high political issues of who rules the country, what the constitution is, what the official religion is, really big matters of church and state, because those are the big matters of the 17th century, to a focus now on what we might call identity politics, but certainly social issues, the social contract, things that are more at that individuated level. A shift, if you like, from focusing from the head to the body of political corpus, in a way. What I really like thinking about the music and performance is we have a sort of, I love things where history isn't just sort of linear or there isn't a sort of one trend. We've got a circularity. And that's in the musical performance, because in sort of the early modern period, so the 17th, early 18th century, and in recent sort of post-World War II history, the songs are really similar because they're mostly pop songs, as in they're commercially produced songs sold by the music industry, often normally sung by one person, and from a sort of perspective of one person singing to many other people. But in the middle, again, mapping onto the idea of the working class, the Industrial Revolution, and then leading to things like the suffragettes, you have a massive change in the kinds of songs. They're far less likely to be commercial. They're far more likely to be amateur songwriting produced by unions, bodies, organizations, church groups, campaigners, political activists, to be sung by lots of people to themselves in the first instance, and to be sung on demonstrations and so on. So they're not, here you, the general public, be influenced by this, but they're sort of, we've got a cause, we're doing this thing together, it's outside commerce, so we're talking Chartist songs, yeah, that sort of thing. And that's the middle period, and it's really strong. And the relative loss of that in recent decades is, I think, a cause for concern, but also thinking about the new generation of strike action and unionization and common cause between them that we're seeing at the moment. I think they could do with some more songs.
That's a really good point. You're saying that the chant, the chant has survived, but the song hasn't. And I wonder whether, or maybe over the coming months, with potentially more striking, whether we will see the song will return and emerge. But I suppose the danger then is that someone will become famous for the song as opposed to the song being famous. So there's the risk of them becoming a superstar as opposed to maybe eclipsing the song.
Yeah, no, and nothing against the chant either. A short, snappy chant is a very powerful thing, and a lot of those longer songs. The really good thing about them is a very short piece of strong music in the middle of them. So if we have a few more great chants, that would be excellent, and we probably do. Again, it's just a matter of their audibility, visibility in a sort of wider social sphere. Yeah.
Definitely,
I don't
yes.
want to be pessimistic about them.
Well, we're actually starting to run out of time, so I think this is a good point to remind everybody about the wonderful website, Our Subversive Voice. You can go back and look up all the things that we've been talking about and lots more to discover. But I think we should probably just have a little quick chat about your book, Vagabonds, because of course your publishers will kill us if we don't. So Vagabonds, Life on the Streets of 19th Century London. So can you tell us a little bit about the book, sort of where it came from and what it's about?
Yeah, I'll try and be very quick. And it's out in paperback this month, very reasonable price. Should be in all good bookshops and probably some very evil ones too. 16th of February. Uh, this was, yeah, very much motivated by my desire as a historian to think about, because I've coming through song, thinking about experiences of life on the street, bottom up history, and then all of those histories of the London street, of the working class, well, below working class poor, the extent to which they're still reliant on the whole on top down sources. Maybe it's a methodological question. I really wanted to get beyond what we all call representation, this coming to an authentic perspective via its mediation by other people, going through literature and imagery and so on, and trying to get to just more people's real experience, accounts, feelings of what it was like to live on the street. And it was possible. But you have to do it, you have to construct it as a kind of patchwork. So this book is a sort of narrative from birth, death, going through the lives, touching on the lives of hundreds of individuals over the period from, say, the 1780s to the 1870s, starting with a chapter on infants and ending with a chapter on the elderly, and focusing on a few blazingly interesting individuals. Joseph Johnson, whom I talked about before, is an example in the fifth chapter of a really fascinating person, and their experiences of what life is really like in those places. And I'm going to put this one on the side of optimism, because I originally titled that project When London Cried, and my wonderful publishers thought that was a bit too much of a downer. And it was sort of a double thinking, because, cries, emotion, tears, but also street cries, projection of voice. That was the point. But Vagabonds, a little bit more exciting, is, I think, doing more justice to the remarkable resilience and ingenuity of the people I've looked at, men, women, boys, girls, people of various ethnicities, even animals, so they got cut out of the final book. And their confrontations with power, primarily, and the ways that they asserted their own life, their own voice on the street. Their tales are truly extraordinary, and I felt very delighted to be able to tell some of them and reflect upon them.
Well, I'm really glad you did change the title, because sort of Vagabonds, it gives that kind of it's sort of a spirit of adventure, which I think comes across in the characters, this sort of adventurous life.
Absolutely, adventure is good, and again, you get people faced with the possibility of, say, going into the workhouse, even just going into a very lowly paid ordinary job, or preserving their freedom and integrity. And even though it's often the less advantageous thing to do, people stick on the street time and again, and not necessarily living on the street, but working on the street. It's one of the great paradoxes, thinking about it from today, that rough sleeping is less of a central issue, because it's far cheaper to get a room for the night than it is to get enough to eat in the 19th century. For a penny will get you a bed. So it's more about the street as a place of, as you say, adventure and excitement, but also of a form of 19th century community and a way of life that is at odds with the sort of march of capitalism and modernity, and also those theories of nationalism, racism, patriarchalism that the 19th century is sort of formally advancing. You have this whole stratum of the people who are existing, flourishing, surviving because their communities, which is not just the street poor, but the people who pass around them, don't buy into that, but are welcoming, accepting, incredibly kind and open. And this vision of the sort of generous, open-minded 19th century was a really compelling one for me, and I think is one to bear in mind today when we think about the kind of society we live in and want to live in.
Definitely. Well, we've got a few moments left, so I'm just going to ask you about sort of the classic question that we always ask writers. So what are you working on now? Please tell us.
Right. So in brief, so finishing this book on protest song, which will be very good, and we hope also to do a more public-facing book, Political History of England in 100 Protest Songs. That sounds like a good book, doesn't it? That sounds
absolutely.
Great.
Yes.
So there's that one. Starting my new project at Newcastle, which is the invention of pop music, mainstream song, class, and culture, 1520 to 2020. A timeline I came up with before the Our Subversive Voice thing came along, but really thinking about what is pop music, what is song, struck by how remarkably unchanged it is over the last 500-600 years. I sort of want to tell a story of things staying the same that is really interesting Uh, and what a song is, because I think it really speaks to very essential things about human nature, culture, society, through the song that I find absolutely fascinating. And I'm juggling these two main projects with writing detective novels, the first of which is out this time next year. Hell and Death, the one I said is called Helltown. They feature a Danish protagonist, Torben Heller, but he works in England, so everyone calls him Hell. Hence the titles. I've got loads of these titles lined up. But again, with the optimism, pessimism, it's interesting because I'm going for the classic whodunit, sort of 1920s, 30s, golden age, Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers vibe and construction and plot, setting it today, and wrestling with the fact that what is the view of these books about society and human nature, and is it essentially pessimistic or not? And certainly in the first one, I think I've tried to give a vision in a book called Hell and Death that is really quite hopeful and optimistic about what most people are like. So I'm going to see how many detective novels I can write where you come away thinking, "Oh, people lovely," rather than, "Oh God, I'm going to be stabbed."
Well, I look forward to finding out more about that, and I think you said it's going to be out early 2024, so everyone keep your eyes peeled. I'm going to end sort of by saying, obviously we'll include lots of links for this recording, so you can go and do your own sort of investigations into some of these marvellous songs and where they came from and the people that wrote and sung them. And yes, I think you'll probably agree with me that Oskar has approached this subject with, I think, large amounts of optimism and positivity, and I think it definitely comes across in all of his writing as well. So thank you very much again, Oskar, for joining us today.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, everyone.